It's Halloween come late on Archetype Analysis, as we'll be taking a look at a GX era archetype known as the Vampire archetype, which was in the GX era used by Camula, which was one of the 7-star assassins in Season 1. And yeah, I know, technically one card was also used in Duel Monsters, but we don't really give a shit about that character now, do we? Anyway, yeah, this is an archetype that's honestly older than the majority of the modern players in the game, so yeah. That's how far this archetype goes, and they got some lots of support waves throughout the coming years, especially during the Zexal era when they were turned into an XC spam archetype, and then their newest support basically made them a lot more playable in the modern day. So let's take a look at said support and the said archetype as a whole. And we start off with their first and only level 1 monster, Vampire Familiar. This is a level 1 zombie with 500 attack and 0 defense, and if this card is special summoned, you can pay 500 life points, add 1 vampire monster from your deck to your hand, except itself of course. And if this card is in your graveyard, you can send a vampire card from your hand or face-up field to the graveyard to special summon this card, but banish it when it leaves the field. And you can only use each effect once per turn. Essentially, this is a 3-of because not only is a level 1 zombie monster, which is summonable by 1/1, highly appreciated in the archetype, but it's one of the archetype's best searchers, even though it has to be special summoned and not summoned by other means in order to perform a search. But hey, Uni-Zombie is a thing, so I guess it can be a lot worse when it comes to that. But yeah, this is essentially a 3-of staple because this one searches monsters. It's a level 1 monster which can be searched out with Verarvdo, 1/1, and other generic level 1 searchers as well. And the same thing can be said about their only level 2, which is Vampire Retainer, which is the exact same array of effects as Familiar, but this one only searches the Vampire back row instead. Not that much of a staple as Familiar, but yeah, it's certainly high up there, and it doesn't even hurt if you decide to do run 3 of them, as opposed to its Familiar counterpart. But Familiar is a definite must run 3 at all times because the sheer amount of generic zombie support that can help out Familiar and Retainer within with their searching is simply amazing, and boosting its own internal archetype consistency is all the more appreciated. So yeah, and not to mention, like I said, the generic zombie support has plenty of monsters which can basically proc their own effects easier, and the effects of these two when they are combined together. So yeah, these two are a very good start, and of course these are some of their newer cards. So yeah, it's obviously where their quality comes from. Next up, we have their only level 3 monster, Vampire Baby. At the end of the battle phase, if this card destroyed an opponent, a monster by battle and sent it to the graveyard this turn, you can special summon that monster to your side of the field. To cut it some slack, yeah, the new wave of Vampire support actually does have a focus in controlling the opponent's monsters, but a worse Goyo Guardian effect on a monster which can't even run over Frog the Gem without an equip spell propping him up is just avant-garde, to say the least. So essentially you just don't run this, as he's way too slow to make any significance in the game. Next up, we have our first level 4, which is Vampire Sorcerer. If this card in your possession is sent to the graveyard by your opponent's card, you can add 1 Dark Vampire monster or 1 Vampire spell or trap from your deck to your hand. You can banish this card from your graveyard, and 1 Dark Vampire monster you normal summon this turn can be normal summoned without tributing. Yeah, this one was a 3-of staple before Retainer and Familiar were introduced because, well, it was the only way the archetype could actually pull off any searching within itself, so it basically ran it out of obligation. Nowadays, I mean, it's a level 4 zombie which can occasionally perform a search, so I guess he doesn't tend to hurt that much. To be ran at least 1 or 2 copies in the main deck, but again, you're just clogging your deck up with a very inconsistent searcher when we have much better searches nowadays. The second effect might seem a bit confusing at first, but it will be much clearer when we get to their other monsters, and that is vampires are based on level 5 and above monsters, mainly level 6 and level 5 monsters, so that's where this effect is supposed to be used for, although the level 5 and above monsters won't be getting tribute summoned anytime soon. So yeah, this is just there for flair, if anything, nowadays. So yeah, run by preference. That's all I'm gonna say for now. Next up, we have Vampire Lady. This card has the effect when this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, declare one card type, monster, spell, or trap, and your opponent sends one card of that type from their deck to the graveyard. Yeah, this is a pretty slow and underwhelming effect, but why would that be, you might be asking? Well, considering the fact that she has 1550 attack and defense for that Evil Swarm experience, and that's just 50 more attacks than Sorcerer, this was basically the age-old gimmick of the archetype, which in future cards will be referred to as the bleed effect, as this card basically was basically focused on destroying the opponent's deck by sending cards directly from it to the graveyard. But yeah, you can pretty much see that this card comes from a meta where when this kind of effect was very harmful to the opponent instead of making them plus all the more. And yeah, the main downside of this thing is basically that you're freely allowing your opponent to set up the graveyard, whichever card you decide to decide for them to send to the graveyard. If you're playing this against a Lightsworn player, God forbid, then you basically make him plus 1 billion if you make him send the correct card to the graveyard. If you for some reason also play this against metal foes, they'll just dump their fusion cards to the graveyard and then plus again immensely off of them, because yeah, that's how modern Yu-Gi-Oh functions. So yeah, just leave this one out, it's pretty much not worth it nowadays. Next monster is part of the archetype due to lore reasons, and that is Bloodsucker. When this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, send the top card of your opponent's deck to the graveyard. Or you cannot be a complete idiot and just run Goblin Zombie instead. Moving on. Next up we have Patrician of Darkness, which is the last monster in the archetype that falls into it due to lore reasons, and its effect is it's our first level 5, first of all, with standard vampire stats, which are 2000 attack and below 2000 defense points. And its effect is that you can choose the attack targets for your opponent's attacks. And the only thing relevant about this card is that this used to cause so many ruling nightmares and chaotic situations, as players would think that you can actually force your opponent's monsters to battle each other. But as it turns out, that's not the case at all, and it hasn't ever been. So yeah, this card has basically been invalidated by the sheer existence of better cards that do the exact same thing. And essentially there's even a battle trap that came way before it that does the exact same thing but better. Next up we have one of the archetype's main poster boys and playmakers for several years, that being Vampire Lord. This is level 5 with 2000 attack and 100 more defense than Patrician of Darkness. And when this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, apply the bleed effect. And once per turn during your next standby phase, after this card in your possession was destroyed and sent to your graveyard by an opponent's card effect, special summon it from the graveyard. Yeah, this card used to legitimately kick ass during the early 2002, because not only was it a level 5 with very formidable stats for the time, but it could also come back during the next turn if it was destroyed by a card effect, which is a recovery effect not shared by many monsters at the time, and combined with the bleed effect, which was released around the time when, again, milling your opponent's deck was harmful to the opponent. It made him a pretty good single tribute monster, outclassed by stuff like Summoned Skull, if anything else. And yeah, sadly, back in the day, the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh, this is basically the time period where this effect could be considered good in the slightest. But nowadays there are just many better playmakers to basically replace this guy whenever necessary. And one of said playmakers is a Shadow Vampire. It's a level 5 with 2000 attack and 0 defense, and cannot be used as material for an Xyz summon except for the Xyz summon of a dark monster. When this card is normal or summoned, you can special summon a dark vampire monster from your hand or deck, except Shadow Vampire. But monsters you control cannot attack for the rest of this turn except that special summoned monster. And now we move on to the other gimmick of the old vampires, which is rank 5 Xyz spamming. Dark rank 5 Xyz monsters, which are not that plentiful to be honest, and for the longest time the internal versatility and consistency of the vampires used to suck heavily due to the fact that, again, they are very specific attribute and level, and they also are focused on going strictly into Xyz monster of very specific rank and attribute. And yeah, the generic rank 5 dark monsters are not too amazing, beyond stuff like number 14 Greedy Saramea, which is an instant counter to Trickstars if you decide to play it, and is a very welcome choice in the deck because it's one of their bigger beatsticks if they decide to go into it. But other than that, they also have their own archetypal rank 5 Xyz monster, which we'll get to in a minute. And yeah, but as for Shadow himself, well, a monster which can summon another member of its archetype from the deck is highly appreciated, and you should never ever consider running less than 3 of these. And same goes for their next monster, which is Vampire Duke. When this card is normal summoned, you can target a dark vampire monster in your graveyard and special summon the target in face-up defense position. And when this card is special summoned, you can apply the bleed effect. And you can only use this effect once per turn, and this card cannot be used as an Xyz material for an Xyz summon except for the Xyz summon of a dark Xyz monster. Basically, the interaction of Duke and Shadow can basically result in a very easy 3 to 4 monster that you can use for Xyz spamming or link spamming if you're basing your deck around link spamming or extra linking, which is completely understandable because one of their archetypal monsters is a Link 2 monster, which is a very welcome addition in the archetype and provides a very interesting and new playstyle, which basically makes vampires a force to be reckoned with. So definitely max out on Duke as well. More on Duke, honestly, than Shadow, if you can believe it, because Duke is a bit more useful than Shadow, in my opinion, as some playtesting has actually confirmed that fact. And next up we move on to some of their newer pieces of support, 2 of them in fact. First of which we have Vampire Fraulein. This is a level 5 with 600 attack and 2000 defense. And when a monster declares an attack, you can special summon this card from your hand in defense position, and you can only use this effect of Vampire Fraulein once per turn. Once per battle, if your zombie monster battles an opponent's monster during damage calculation, quick effect, you can pay life points multiples of 100, with the maximum being 3000. Your battling monsters gain that much attack and defense during that damage calculation only. At the end of the battle phase, if this card destroyed any monsters by battle, special summon them from the graveyard to your field. And yeah, now the Familiar and Retainer were basically sneak peeks of the playstyle of the newer pieces of Vampire support, and that is using the life points as resources to pull off their effects and controlling the opponent's monsters. Kind of like Synchro Up Psychics, the early Synchro Up Psychics used to do. And Fraulein is actually pretty busted. Not only is it a non-once per turn mobile honest with the ability to give your attacking monsters a 3000 attack point boost that your power creeps the Injection Fairy Lily out of existence. And yeah, it's also a very easily special summonable level 5 for some more Xyz spamming, and it also has the graveyard resummon effect, which is actually what the majority of the archetype also shares with their newer pieces of support. And yeah, Fraulein is a definite 3-off staple, and due to her low attack value, she can actually be easily searchable by some other generic zombie support, which is actually pretty appreciated as well. So yeah, run 3 at all times. Next up we have Vampire GRIMSON, another one of their newer pieces of support. Has the exact same stats as Patrician of Darkness, which is kind of interesting. And if a monster you control would be destroyed by battle or an opponent's card effect, you can pay 1000 life points for each monster that will be destroyed instead, and you must protect all monsters that will be destroyed if you use this effect. And at the end of the battle phase, if this card destroyed on any monsters by battle, you can special summon them from the graveyard to your field. The graveyard resummon effect in any future vampire cards that will come in the video will be just simply referred to as the graveyard resummon effect. But as for GRIMSON's actual effect, it's honestly pretty interesting given the fact that you can actually protect your other non-archetypal monsters as well, which makes it actually pretty damn versatile. The downside being, of course, because the fact that you must protect all monsters and not just a select few, because some of the vampires do actually have pretty decent floating effects, so that's a bit of a bummer. Or you know, the other zombie monsters actually do want to be put to the graveyard as soon as possible for their graveyard effects or floating effects. So yeah, if you decide to run this, I actually would not recommend more than one, because I honestly don't find more than one to be necessary in the deck. Next up we have their last level 5, which is Vampire Dragon. When this tribute summoned card is sent from the field to the graveyard, you can add one level 4 or lower monster from your deck to your hand. You tried. This is a perfectly fine effect, but just not for its own archetype. The fact that you can basically search out any level 4 or lower monster from your deck, like any in the game, is simply mind-boggling, as this is actually a very powerful way to search stuff, but the way the search is performed is just not good. It specifically needs to be tribute summoned when it leaves the field, and it needs to be sent to the graveyard, and which makes it way too slow to make any significance in the grand state of things. So yeah, just not worth it. Next up we have our first level 6, which is Vampire's Curse. When this card is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, you can pay 500 life points and special summon it during the standby phase of the next turn, and when you do, it gains 500 attack. Yeah, it truly is a Vampire's Curse that they have on a monster this underwhelmingly bad, which was released early on into the Zexal era, so yeah, just ignore this and pretend it never existed, just like the non-canonical one-shot manga it originates from. Next up we have Vampire Grace. When a level 5 or higher zombie type monster is special summoned to your side of the field by the effect of a zombie type monster when this card is in your graveyard, you can pay 2000 life points and special summon this card from your graveyard, and you can only use this effect of Vampire Grace once per turn. And once per turn you can apply the bleed effect. Okay, so the second effect, though, that being the bleed effect, is not going to be used like ever unless you're playing against a deck which really does not want its decks to be in the cards to be in the graveyard, which I doubt it even exists at this point. But yeah, other than its very specific and summoning condition, it's not used for much. Although the fact that you need to pay 2000 life points in order to resummon her is supremely annoying. Well, it is worth running at least one copy in the deck, because one of their newer Xyz monster is a rank 6 monster, so I guess running one couldn't possibly hurt, since she can be also used as a link material as well. I'm just saying. Anyway, next up we move on to Vampire Red Baron. We have 2 more new pieces of support coming up right now. And once per turn you can pay 1000 life points, then target one monster your opponent controls and one other vampire monster you control, and switch the control of those monsters. And it has the graveyard resummon effect. Blatantly, this is a better version of an archetypal creature swap, as it actually lets you select both monsters that you want to exchange, as you can basically give the opponent something easy to run over. Maybe if you're actually running Sorcerer, you can give Sorcerer to your opponent and then blow it up by a card effect, so you can basically perform a surge. But then again, this is a very simple play, very simple and inconsistent play, I should say. But yeah, you can basically give them any other monster you might not need at the moment that might have a decent floating effect, and in order to also steal some of the opponent's bigger monsters, which is very nice. But again, it's a bit of a specific utility, so so running more than one is usually not necessary. Next up we have on their last level 6, which is Vampire Scarlet Scourge. If this card is normal or special summon, you can pay 1000 life points to target a vampire monster in your graveyard and except Vampire Scarlet Scourge and special summon it, but it cannot attack this turn. And you can only use this effect once per turn. And it has the graveyard resummon effect. It's essentially the same thing as Vampire Duke, but one level higher and with 200 more attack points and a lot more defense points. But overall, it's a very nice card, and it's the definitive level 6 3-off staple in the archetype, simply due to the sheer amount of things it can basically pick up from the graveyard and put it back onto your field. So, yeah. And combined that their best Xyz monster is also rank 6, it's all the more welcome in the deck. Run 3. Next up we have Vampire Vamp, which is our only level 7 monster. And once per turn, when this card or a vampire monster is normal summoned to your field, you can target one face-up monster your opponent controls whose attack is higher than this card's, equip it to that card. If this card gains attack equal to the combined original attack of the of the monsters equipped to it by this effect. And if this card is sent to the graveyard while equipped with a card by this effect, special summon this card from the graveyard. What happened here? This was one of the more simpler effects to basically make, but you just slapped a bunch of gimmicks onto it for no reason. And yeah, unsurprisingly, this is actually a TCG exclusive from 2014 and Primal Origin. And I think, yeah, it came out in Primal Origin, and it's actually pretty inconsistent and bad. It basically relies on a vampire monster on it or itself being normal summon specific, which is already a big minus in my book. It targets, so yeah, it's kind of underwhelming in today's format when there's a lot of targeting protection going on. And the floating effect is something that should have said, like, when this card would be destroyed, destroy the equipped monster instead. But no, it just, yeah, you just resummon it after being destroyed already. What is this supposed to like synergize with, like metal flows and vampire hybrid builds? And yeah, you do not tend to mishmash vampires and metal foes. But I guess it's level 7 if you're deciding to make a rank 7 spam vampire build, considering the fact that rank 7 monsters are some of the better monsters in the game. I mean, the option's there if you want to take it, but the fact that her stats are so low for a level 7 also adds some more salt onto the wound. It's also one of their monsters that has been severely nerfed in terms of artwork due to damn TCG making some last minute interventions on its artwork. But fret not, as Twitter user Sayu is here to save the day with his new revamped work of Vampire Vamp's artwork. And if it at any point Vampire Vamp should get any of those lost art or alternate art reprints, let's just make sure that this is the artwork that she gets, because it looks absolutely fabulous. Next up we have, oh boy, this is something. DRACULEA Vampire is their newest piece of support from Selection Pack 10. And if this card is normal summoned, you can target up to 2 monsters in your opponent's graveyard, special summon them to your field in defense position, but negate their effects, and when a monster effect is activated while a monster with the same name is in the graveyard, quick effect, you can negate the activation. If a monster is special summoned from your opponent's graveyard, you contribute 2 monsters to special summon this card from your graveyard, and you can only use each effect of DRACULEA Vampire once per turn. Why do the vampire monsters that have that come out in the set where they are the only piece of new support are just bafflingly terrible? I mean, don't get me wrong, this can actually be a pretty strong removal and shutdown effect, especially since you can basically set it up yourself, as in this thing can basically stop Ash Blossoms and other hand traps from functioning properly. But the fact that it requires such an ungodly amount of setup is just baffling. It's a level 8 monster, which means you can basically send it to the graveyard with stuff like Trade-In. Although vampire decks tend to use Allure of Darkness for their draw power most of the time, so I guess that isn't even a plus either. The resummon effect is so unbelievably costly that I simply cannot put it into words. You're just better off paying 2,000 life points for Vampire Grace if you want a resummon effect such as this. Yeah, just not worth it. Just don't run it. And now we move on to their final level 8 monster, which is Vampire Genesis, which is their biggest beatstick with 3000 attack and 2100 defense, and cannot be normal summoned or set, and must be special summoned from your hand by banishing a Vampire Lord you control, and cannot be special summoned by other ways. Once per turn, you can discard one zombie type monster to the graveyard and target one zombie monster in your graveyard with a level less than the discarded zombie type monster and special summon that target. Yeah, this basically debuted in the Zombie Madness structure deck, and it should have stayed there because, yeah, this was obviously intended to be a generic zombie type boost. But the fact that it relies on banishing a face-up monster, which is not even worth running, a very specific monster, that being Vampire Lord, in order to simply summon it, and then the resummon effect basically restricting you to lower levels instead of lower or equal levels means you'll basically run out of monsters to cycle through very quickly. And combined with the fact that the generic zombie support and the internal vampire consistency is more than capable than fulfilling this card's purpose on their own, basically makes it not worth running ever. Now we move on to their extra deck monsters, first of which we have the rank 5 XCs, Crimson Knight Vampire BRAM. This is a rank 5 with 2500 attack and 0 defense, requires 2 level 5 zombie monsters as material, and you can detach one material from this card and target one monster in your opponent's graveyard and special summon that target to your field. But only that monster can attack for the rest of this turn. You can only use this effect once per turn, and once per turn during the standby phase of the next turn after this card you control was destroyed by your opponent's card and sent to the graveyard. Special summon this card in defense position. It's alright for at least for the time when this card came out, since basically you can either steal the opponent's resources and use them for your extra deck plays during that turn, or in this case link materials, or you can simply just fetch the opponent's resource from the graveyard so the opponent won't be able to use it during the next turn. Or, yeah, this is basically a card that basically is focused on screwing over with the opponent's graveyard setup, and that's about as far as it goes. And the revival effect is kind of underwhelming since we're talking about an Xyz monster coming back with no Xyz materials with 0 defense in defense position, so yeah. I mean, you can run one if you really feel like it, but your extra deck space would be much more better spent on their next Xyz monster, which is also their final Xyz monster, DHAMPIR Vampire Sheridan. This is a rank 6 monster with 2600 attack and 1000 defense, requires 2 or more Xyz level 6 monsters, and if you use a monster with a level that is owned by your opponent for the Xyz summon of this card, treat it as level 6. Once per turn you can detach one material from this card, then target one card your opponent controls and send it to the graveyard. Once per turn, if a monster card is sent from the field to the graveyard by to your opponent's graveyard by a card effect, or a monster is destroyed by battle and sent to your opponent's graveyard, you can detach one material from this card to special summon one of those monsters to your field in defense position. This is honestly one of their better cards, simply by, well, everything. First of all, the summoning condition. Basically, any monster you snag from the opponent can be turned into a level 6 with the existence of this, since and thus it also cuts down on necessary level 6 monsters in order to basically bring this thing out. Not to mention that it requires any level 6 monster, so it's completely generic. You can also use more than 2 level 6 monsters in order to summon it, and not to mention that the fact that it basically sends to the graveyard simply and does not destroy, and thus it dodges floating effects the opponent's monster might have, and also you may summon the monster after it has already hit the graveyard to your field, which you can then use to summon another Sheridan and then continue the onslaught again in the next turn, because these effects are a hard once per turn for a very good reason. Such a versatile boss monster for an archetype that used to struggle on putting 2 level 5s onto the field in the early days, and which is simply very baffling thing to see after all these years. And yeah, DHAMPIR Vampire Sheridan is definitely the definitive boss monster of the Vampire archetype for a very good reason. Run 2 or 3 of these at all times. And well, also one of their cards which is definitely worth running is the Link 2 monster Vampire Sucker, which is Link 2 which requires 2 zombie monsters, points bottom left and bottom right. And if you would tribute a monster for a tribute summon, you can tribute a zombie monster on that your opponent controls, even though you do not control them. You can only use each effect of the following effects of Vampire Sucker once per turn. You can target one monster in your opponent's graveyard and special summon it to your opponent's field and defense position, but it becomes a zombie monster. And if a zombie monster is special summoned from either graveyard, draw 1 card. Literally run 3 of these, hell I would run 4 if I could. This basically incentivizes you to build plays revolving around the field spell Zombie World and other cards that support it, which would frankly give the archetypal field spell run for its money, because the effect is just that good. It essentially, this is basically an archetypal Monarch Stormfort on licks, and not to mention that it can also provide some neat pluses with the for the archetype, and also it can actually provide kaiju removal for vampires, which is nothing to scoff at all, since kaiju removal is the absolute strongest form of removal in the game. And not to mention with the other generic Link 2 monsters the archetype can go into, the Vampire Sucker becomes even way more versatile than it initially seemed at first. And not to mention that there are even some vampire builds which focus exclusively on control builds with Vampire Sucker and completely ignore Sheridan. And yeah, this is coming from the same mouth that praised Vampire Sheridan in a few moments ago. So yeah, this is a definite 3-off staple in all vampire builds. And now we move on to their back row. First of which we have the field spell Vampire Kingdom. Zombie type monsters gain 500 attack during damage calculation only. Once per turn when a card is sent from the opponent's deck to the graveyard, target 1 card on the field, send 1 dark vampire monster from your hand or deck to the graveyard, and if you do, destroy that target. It used to be decent several years ago, but the fact that the effect is mandatory, meaning automatic, you basically have to watch out if you're applying the bleed effect while the opponent controls no cards, meaning you'll have to destroy one of your own. Most likely it's gonna be this field spell right here. But yeah, it's not worth it nowadays, because the bleed effect vampires are not worth running, well, most of them anyway. And the bleed effect has fallen out of relevance heavily, so just run Zombie World instead. Next up we have Vampire's Desire, which is one of their newer pieces of support, and it allows you to activate one of these effects. It either allows you to target 1 face-up monster you control and send 1 vampire monster from your deck to the graveyard with a different level than that from that monster, and if you do, the targeted monster becomes the level of that sent monster in the graveyard until the end of this turn. Or it allows you to target a vampire monster in your graveyard and send 1 monster you control to the graveyard, and if you do, special summon the targeted monster, and you can only activate 1 Vampire's Desire per turn. Both of these are extremely good effects and warrant the card being ran at 3, because for the first effect it basically eases up the conditions for XC spamming, and the second is an archetypal monster reborn, which is always appreciated, so that's a nice plus. Run 3 at all times. Next up we have Vampire's Domain, which is their last new spell card they received, and once per turn you can pay 500 life points, and during your main phase this turn you can normal summon 1 vampire monster in addition to your normal summoner set, even if this card leaves the field. You gain this effect once per turn, and each time your vampire monster inflicts battle damage to your opponent, gain the same amount of life points. Okay, first of all, this is one of the only cards that allows the archetype to replenish life points after they have used it up to activate their effects, which is pretty good. Very good, in fact, sometimes necessary, but the double summon effect is definitely the reason why you would want to run at least 2 or 3 copies of this thing, because it's just simply that amazing. And not to mention it's searchable by retainers, so you do not have to usually run 3 at all times, because you would want to save up space for some other better cards, since Retainer can, again, very easily snag it from the deck and put it onto your field. So yeah, definitely run this one. And their final spell card is Overpowering Eye. Target one zombie monster you control with 2000 or less attack, and it can attack your opponent directly this turn. Oh, well, it sure smells like 2002 in here. Just leave this in the Romanian coffin they excavated this thing from. And now we move on to their trap cards, first of which we have Vampire. It's a normal trap card that has the following effects. If you have no card in your field zone and all face-up monsters you control minimum 1 are zombie type, activate one Vampire Kingdom directly from your deck, then you can special summon a Dark Vampire monster from your graveyard in face-up defense position, and you can only activate one takeover per turn. Seeing how the field spell is not worth running, neither is this, so let's just move on. Vampire Awakening allows you to special summon one vampire monster from your deck but destroy it during the end phase of this turn, and you can only activate one Vampire Awakening per turn. God, I would have loved it if this was like an archetypal hero lives. Well, it is actually, but this is a trap card, but although I would have loved it if it was a spell card, because it's essentially a 3-off staple, because it kickstarts all of your plays, literally. It basically, if you decide to summon either Retainer or Familiar, it basically kicks off an engine of constant searching and recovery from the graveyard that the archetype is very well known for. Or if you decide to bring a higher level vampire monster, you can basically figure out something from there. So yeah, definitely worth running at 3 copies in your deck. And finally we have the counter trap Vampire Domination. When a spell, trap, or monster effect is activated while you control vampire monster, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy that card. Then if it was a monster card, gain life points equal to its original attack, and you can only activate one Vampire Domination once per turn. This is the archetypal Omni-Negate, which also replenishes your life points if you happen to negate a monster effect, which will be happening like 90% of the time, so I shouldn't waste any more time and saying that you should be running all 3 at all times. And now we finally come to the grading scale. In terms of consistency, the sheer amount of generic zombie support and the internal archetypal consistency means that in terms of consistency there are absolutely 0 complaints, and it should be given a very deserved 3 out of 3. Power gets a 2 out of 3. Well, the archetype does have a lot of 2000 attack monsters, but that's usually the highest amount of attack that they can reach, even though Vampire Fraulein exists. But again, you might not always have the right amount of life points for Fraulein's effect to truly shine, so I'm giving it a 2 out of 3 here. In terms of comeback ability, the sheer amount of generic zombie support they have and the interaction between Duke and Shadow is just enough for me to give them a 2 out of 3. Protection actually barely exists, and the only form of sensible protection is Grimson, but Grimson is not a 3-off staple or anything, and he's not on the field all that often for it to really matter. But still, the level of protection Grimson offers is simply very powerful, so I will be generous and give them a 2 out of 3, but it's actually on a very thin ice here. But as for the versatility, again, I have to give them a 3 out of 3 here, because if this was some years ago, this would have been a very obvious 1 out of 3 due to the fact that the newer support did not exist, and the only thing they would have been good for is making a rank 5 Dark Xyz monster, which again was not very plentiful and the most prominent playstyle for the deck. So yeah, but nowadays they have access to a variety of Link monsters such as Vampire Sucker, their own monster of course, the Avenged Savior, and other generic Link and Xyz monsters they can go into. They can actually run a few tuners thanks to Unizombie, which itself is a tuner monster, so they can utilize stuff like Cypherime Lord Omega, which is definitely a plus in my book. And not to mention they can also be comboed well with Shiranuis for some more synchro love and support if you decide to play a synchro spam deck with them. So yeah, they definitely really stand out in this regard. And yeah, vampires are definitely an archetype that was done right, even though they had a very abysmal start many years ago. I would definitely love to see some new support, and especially I'd like to see a retrain for Vampire Vamp, because that artwork is just simply amazing, and the theming is just my cup of tea, as I would usually say. But that would be the end for this archetype analysis. Tomorrow I'll be taking a look at the last legacy of the Worthless archetype that'll be appearing on the show. And it's also from the GX era, so rejoice, all of you fanatics of bad GX era archetype design. So, yeah. Thank you all so much for watching. Stay tuned for more vids, walkthroughs, and updates. Comment, like, and subscribe. As usual, I'll upload the next vid whenever I can. And once again, I would like to wish a very happy birthday to my ex, who is celebrating it today, which is something I already mentioned in the top 10 vampire girls in anime list. So yeah. Thank you all for watching, and see you all, and have a good day. Peace.